Some newspapers dig. Some newspapers are a constant embarrassment to the powerful. Some manage to be entertaining, provocative, and fair all at the same time. There are a few such newspapers in Canada. That's from a report written in the 1970s by the Special Senate Committee on Mass Media. Were they right then, or are they right now? Mainstream media tries to report all the news that's fit to print, but the reality is it can only cover a handful of stories, and its ability to dig deep has been hampered by shrinking budgets. Enter independent media outlets that are picking up the slack by taking on the issues that fall outside of the columns, airwaves, and screens of traditional media. In many cases, the journalists working for these outlets are some of the most tenacious diggers in the business. They take on specific issues, and they do so from a particular point of view, peeling back the layers, revealing what others may have missed. In the case of Site C, it was independent media outlet DeSmog Canada that uncovered facts about the controversial hydro project that everyone else missed. And once revealed, even the New York Times repeatedly cited the tiny online publication that is managed from a dining room table in Victoria. We invited DeSmog Canada's editor-in-chief, Emma Gilchrist, to join us for a conversation that matters about the role of independent media in a democracy.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Well, here we are in the heart of the independent media juggernaut DeSmog Canada. In other words, we're in your home.
Yep.
Tell me, what is DeSmog Canada? How did it come about? And how important is it that we support independent efforts like yours?
So DeSmog Canada is an online, nonprofit, independent news source, and we're really focused on energy and environment stories. So we work the environment beat like almost nobody else in Canada at this point. It's like if you opened up your newspaper and there was an environment section. We're that, except there isn't that in your newspaper.
Got to get you to hang on for a second when we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Sorry for the interruption, but I need your help. I'm asking you to support the show by becoming a patron. That means pledging $1 per show. Conversations is a unique program. There's no grandstanding, no arguing, no yelling. Instead, I sit down with people who have unique insights, specialized knowledge, and experiences that inform and enlighten. And we do this on an incredibly limited budget with a very small crew. Well, this is my office and it's where I edit the show. And then once it's ready, we give it away. You know, so many different websites around the world are carrying the show, but they get it for free. They don't pay us. So I'm asking you to pledge $1 per show by going to patreon.com/conversations that matter. Thanks. We want to keep producing conversations, and with your help, we can. Now let's get back to the show. Well, not with the kind of dedicated resource, because they can't afford to do it. How are you able to do it?
Well, we're basically pioneering kind of a new model for it in Canada. So we're one of very few nonprofit media outlets in Canada. I can count them all on one hand. Increasingly, we're funded by reader donations, and the future, we think, is in a member-funded model like we're seeing around the world with The Guardian. The Guardian now has more people paying for its journalism than ever before. The Correspondent in the Netherlands now has 60,000 paying members in a country half the size of Canada. So we think there's really an appetite for that good quality journalism, but to get it started, it takes some seed funding. And so we've received some funding from philanthropic foundations. So we get some grants, but we're still a tiny organization. We have 2 full-time staff. So we're basically, running it on a shoestring as we try to build out this larger vision for an independent, reader-funded journalism in Canada.
So how, and I think that this is the challenge, how do you create credibility in this marketplace that is filled with so many different voices?
It's one of the biggest challenges, for sure, because just being in that digital media landscape, we're often called alternative media.
Right.
And I really take issue with that, because I think just because you're running a news outlet on the internet doesn't make you alternative, in 2018. So I think what's really important, and what we've really tried to do, is to be just really consistently high quality and reliable. So over time, that work speaks for itself. We've been around for 5 years now, and we're finally getting to that point where, we're in the press gallery at the BC legislature. We're working side by side, every other major news outlet in this province. And we've built that reputation for ourselves as being really reliable and, being professional journalists.
So as an independent media outlet, you aren't running around saying, oh, we're unbiased, or we're trying to be as neutral as possible. You're actually taking a different perspective. You're saying this is our worldview, and that's the lens through which we report.
Yeah.
What are the advantages and what are some of the disadvantages of doing that?
Well, I think honestly it's more honest to take that perspective, because every news outlet is reporting from a certain worldview.
Of course they are.
Many times it's a kind of a status quo worldview, and so it's a little bit more hidden. And so, we don't name that, but in much of our traditional media, there is an explicit worldview. The financial drivers of traditional media outlets are, status quo business interests a lot of the time. So for us, we center a different set of concerns. We put the public interest at the center, we put the environment at the center of our reporting, and we put science at the center of our reporting. And that's just really non-negotiable for us. So we don't do he said, she said journalism. We're doing what we like to call sense-making journalism. So, we grapple in an in-depth way with some really complex issues. And the stories we publish, we like to actually help people make sense of a really complicated world, as opposed to, the normal type of journalism you might read in the newspaper. Sometimes you leave the story and you don't really, I don't know if I just got smarter or what, it's that kind of he said, she said. And that often gives a sort of false balance to stories too, because there aren't two equivalent sides to every story.
This is one of the interesting challenges that I think mainstream media is having to grapple with right now. I stopped watching CNN because they seem to be so committed to this, well, you're the left, you're the right, you both have an equal perspective, or you agree with this or you disagree with that. I'm gonna let you both just natter away at one another, to the point where I go, okay, I'm not sure that I'm better informed. One person is a better performer than the other. Does that mean that I'm appropriately educated or enlightened? And so it becomes very challenging. But they have tremendous resources, you don't. And so you're saying, well, okay, I'm going to weight the quality of that voice or that perspective. But that means you have to do a tremendous amount of work, and it puts a lot of pressure on you to make sure you get it right. How do you do that?
Yeah, it is a real challenge, but for us, the number one thing is that we want our pieces to have intellectual honesty. And, something that I've learned from some of my greatest mentors in journalism and in writing is that a really wonderful story is a journey with a really interesting mind. So, the journalists that we like to read the most are often people who are, they're really curious, they're asking really interesting questions about the world, and they're really honestly engaging in an issue. And they're kind of, as opposed to that he said, she said journalism, they're doing this is what I thought then, this is what I think now. They're going on a journey.
And this is what I learned along the way.
Exactly,
yes,
and they're being a bit more open and transparent about what that process looks like. And I really think that that's the future of journalism. But yeah, it is more time intensive. One of the upsides of operating online, though, is that you don't need to fill a newspaper every day, right? With a newspaper, you kind of have that daily miracle happening, and you just have to fill the pages. And same thing with TV news, right? It's you have to fill an amount of space, and that doesn't necessarily. We used to call it
a black hole. It had to be filled every day.
And it doesn't necessarily drive the best news values.
No, it doesn't.
Whereas for us, because of our model, we're also ad-free, so we're not a click-driven model, right? So we can really put the focus on, we want to have stories that have a positive impact in the world, that help people understand complex issues, that shine a spotlight on issues that otherwise aren't being covered anywhere else. And we have such limited resources that we need to be pretty selective in how we choose our stories.
Okay, so that leads to, what are your resources? How many of there are you? And how many different stories are you trying to pursue at any given time?
Yeah, so we have a core team of about 5 people, which are 2 full-time people, 2 part-time investigative journalists, and a couple really core freelancers on top of that. And you know, in a typical week, we're publishing between 5 and 7 stories. So
Good.
yeah, as editors, you know, we're always probably juggling up to about 10 stories. You know, monitoring that kind of daily news stuff, but we're always looking to get beyond the sensational daily headlines and get to the foundational. So instead of reporting on like every, you know, pipeline brouhaha, we're looking at like, why are we having these really polarized conversations in Canada about natural resources? Why are these pipeline debates playing out the way that they are? How could this be done better? Like looking around the world, is it being done better anywhere else? And you know, that leads to a lot of questions about our environmental assessment process, which we're currently reviewing. And so we end up doing more coverage of those big root issues like how do we make decisions about natural resources? How is public input part of that? How do we consider climate change? Those kind of big questions, which ultimately, I think if we grapple with those, might help us move forward as a society.
Okay, so we live in a democratic country, thankfully, but it means that we're supposed to get involved. And one of the things is that you hope that journalism is going to cast a light on things that people, citizens, voters need to be aware of. From your perspective, you know, you bring up the fact that the natural resource use in our country has become so polarized. What do you think is happening that is creating that polarization?
I mean, I think there's a lot of factors. I think just looking at the realities of it, like Canada is in a very unique position in the world in that we live in a place that is home to a tremendous wealth of natural resources at a time that the world is awakening to a new set of facts around the reality of burning a lot of those resources. That's a very difficult thing to grapple with. On top of that, we also live in a country with some of the last savable wild landscapes on the planet. So there's a real desire to protect and save some of the places that we have here. And I think as Canadians, we often, you know, kind of take that for granted. Like that when you look around the world, most landscapes don't have large carnivores like bears or cougars or so forth on the landscape anymore.
Yeah,
right?
elk,
So we live in this
caribou,
incredibly, I mean, an incredible place, like, you know, and that's what Canadians love about their country are the outdoors. And yet at the same time, you know, there's this immense pressure to develop those resources at the same time as, you know, the world is realizing that we really need to get off of fossil fuels. So I think that's going to be a tricky conversation, no matter what.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, I do think that a lot of the media coverage that we have of these issues, it does them a real disservice because it paints things in black and white, and it kind of creates caricatures of each side of the debate, as if there is even like an each side of the debate. You know, It's like environmentalists are over here like hanging off of bridges with banners, and you know, like people in the oil sands are over here, you know, driving their big trucks and not caring about the environment. And that's not the truth.
No, it's not.
That's not the way it actually is.
Yeah.
And because there's such a lack of resources in our media landscape these days in Canada, we aren't getting the stories that have more of that nuance, the human faces, the fact that even people who work in the oil patch are conflicted about, you know, the fact that we need to get off of fossil fuels, and yet they're still such an important part of our economy. We're constantly pitting economy versus environment in our traditional media, and it doesn't have to be that way. It's simply not that way. I mean, you can't have a healthy economy without, you know, clean air and clean water and a livable climate.
So how then does DeSmog Canada help to enrich that debate? Because I'm sure that there are people who would be listening to you right now going, but hang on a second, didn't you say earlier that you're coming at it from one perspective? And so why is it important to have that perspective to be able to have an informed debate that moves us away from polarization? And I'm sure you can imagine somebody going, but.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think it's a really tricky ground to walk, but we really do try to tell stories in a more nuanced manner that put a human face on them, that don't contribute to tribalism and polarization. we make a real effort, not to be dogmatic about these things. So we're pragmatists, and just because we're reporting on the energy and environment beat doesn't mean that we have any singular perspective on those things. It's just that we're working that beat at a time that, very few other people are, and we're being really thoughtful and conscious about the way that we tell these stories.
So one of the things, because I consider this show to be independent media as well, I run up against all of a sudden, I'm talking to a variety of experts, people who I think really are in the know, but then I want to talk to people who are in decision-making roles, particularly in government, and it's much, much harder to get them to say, oh yeah, okay, I'll come and be a part of that. Yet you seem to be having some pretty good success. What was the path to you getting to that point where you were starting to get phone calls returned?
Yeah. So a part of it I think has been time and just our growing following. So we just have a large enough readership now that we're a media outlet that has real consequences for politicians. But definitely becoming part of the legislative press gallery was a big step as well, because now our reporters can be down there every day, they can be in the scrums, and that means that if you submit a question and it's not responded to, then you're going to ask it in front of 10 other reporters.
And they might pick up on it and so
exactly,
on.
And that's not the outcome that a politician wants. So that's been a real game changer for us to be down there.
Now, congratulations on the fact that I think that you're punching way beyond your weight. Like you are breaking stories here that others aren't, and they're getting picked up internationally. So, let's talk a little bit about what that process is like. How do you get to the heart of a story where others can't? Like, how are you managing to dig into those?
Yeah, so part of it is choosing the right stories, I think. And so choosing, really weighty stories of the public interest that are not receiving the attention they deserve in other media. So the classic example for us is the Site C dam.
Right.
That's the issue that we've really made a lot of our name on. And, other media didn't have the resources or didn't make the choices to really cover that in a super in-depth way, whereas we have dogged that issue. And it all really got started with, at first we said, we're going to write a 10-part series on the Site C dam. We're going to look at, the demand, the environmental consequences, the alternatives, and went in totally open-minded, like maybe this is a great project, maybe this is the, necessary. And then the things we learned through that, raised a lot of questions. And so you kind of build this body of knowledge. And that's one of the really wonderful things about being a beat reporter, right? Is working that day in and day out. So, I've been reporting on Site C for 4 years now. And, so you get this body of knowledge. And the first really big breakthrough for us on Site C was, I had actually read the report by the Joint Review Panel.
Right.
It was like a 400-page report, and I consistently got the sense in the rest of the media that nobody had really read it, because if you read it, there were some really damning sections. And we had written various stories about geothermal, for instance, because geothermal was really named in there as something that the BC government was told to investigate 30 years ago and had failed to. Anyways, I kind of picked up through reading the report that the authors of this report were obviously not really very supportive of the Site C dam. And so I reached out to the chair of the panel,
Right.
Harry Swain, and much to my astonishment, he agreed to meet me.
Much to my astonishment too. Congratulations.
Thank you. And then he agreed to do an interview, and that was kind of our first really big scoop on Site C, and and then it was just scoop after scoop after scoop, because people start coming to us with those types of stories. And this fall, when the BC Utilities Commission report finally came out, it felt like such vindication of all the work that we had done, because it was oh yeah, it is over budget and wasn't needed, and alternatives were cheaper. And
your reaction to the Premier's decision to move forward? Did it catch you by surprise?
No, it didn't. I always thought it was kind of a 50-50. I think it was a really tricky political decision, and from my perspective as a journalist, I always really believed that we should have gone through the appropriate public process, and that process would have been to have the BC Utilities Commission review the cost and demand of the project before it began construction. So, from my perspective, that's always what should have happened, and that's what, we reported pretty hard on the fact that there were a lot of gaps of knowledge.
Right.
And it ended up happening too late.
We're looking at a changing landscape that I think puts mainstream media as we knew it in a no-win situation. They can't dedicate the resources. They don't know whether it's going to work. And as you pointed out, they got that black hole that they have to fill every day. And so this, I think, highlights why independent media outlets like yours are even more important than before. Because if we live in a democracy, we need this fourth estate that is actually shining light on those issues that serve as an early warning system that something's not right. Sorry, I'm talking for you.
You're passionate about this. I like it. I like it.
Because
but it's true. Like some people have said that we're kind of that canary in the coal mine because, ordinary people don't have time to read those reports or to go to city council meetings or to follow along the environmental assessment review process.
Right.
And, for democracy to function, you do need a healthy news media to be serving that watchdog role. And, that's where we really see ourselves filling in is into this, growing gap to fill in that coverage.
Right. But you have to be meticulous in your reporting because in a world where credibility in media is dive bombing, I think for the first time ever, media outlets have become less than trusted, not just in North America, but globally. Independent media, I think, has to be even more disciplined in saying, I'm going to stay true to the story.
Oh, it's true, for sure. I mean, I think we need to be 10 times better than traditional media to get the same level of respect, to be honest. Like we can't make a mistake.
So are you finding acceptance from mainstream media outlets? Like when you show up all of a sudden, is there like...
We're shaking things up a little bit, for sure. There was at least a little bit of resistance to us joining the press gallery.
Do you know that if you go back to about the 1880s, 1890s, I think there were more than 70 daily newspapers in New York City. Wow. And they were all subscription-based. There was no advertising at that time. Yeah. And so the model that we think we know wasn't really the traditional model. Yeah. And all of those papers, like you, had a voice. And so they spoke to their constituency. Yeah. And it was only with the introduction of advertising that advertisers started to say, well, I want you to have a little bit more like neutral tone. And this is where this idea of objective reporting came in, which is virtually impossible anyway.
Well, it is, I think it's a bit of a myth, to be honest. And I think when you look around the world, I mean, you look at someone like The Guardian, they do really great public interest reporting. I started my journalism career in England, and they, if they see something that's happening that's against the public interest, those newspapers get after it.
Well, I want to thank you for your tenacity and doing your job and going out and looking after the public interest. Thank you very much, and I wish you the best of luck as we move forward.